The call came at 6:23 a.m. on a Thursday morning that started like any other but ended with revelations that changed everything I thought I understood about political loyalty, voter manipulation, and what happens when the very people you trust most decide you're no longer useful to their ambitions. I was having my usual morning coffee when David Chen called with urgent news. A former campaign strategist who now tracks political sentiment across multiple demographic groups, David has sources embedded in networks that most Washington insiders don't know exist. When David calls with urgent news, it usually means something is happening that will reshape the political landscape in ways most people won't understand until weeks later. "Mr. President," he said, exhaustion mixed with fear in his voice, "you need to know what happened overnight. Two massive political implosions just occurred simultaneously, and they're connected in ways that reveal something terrifying about how modern politics actually operates." What he told me over the next 40 minutes painted a picture of systematic deception and calculated betrayal that would have been unthinkable in the politics I knew during my presidency. We weren't just looking at routine political disappointments or normal electoral setbacks where politicians fail to deliver on campaign promises due to legislative obstacles or changing circumstances. We were witnessing the complete collapse of trust between political leaders and their supporters, orchestrated by people who understood that loyalty could be weaponized just as effectively as opposition. "The Mamdani situation exploded first," David explained, and I could hear him shuffling through papers, probably documents that would never see public release. His supporters across multiple countries just discovered that everything they believed about his mission, his methods, and his motivations was based on carefully constructed lies that his own organization had been spreading for months. But that was just the beginning. While Mamdani's support network was crumbling under the weight of revealed deception, something even more devastating was happening to Chuck Schumer. His own Democratic colleagues, people he had worked with for decades, people who owed their positions to his leadership and support, were systematically destroying his credibility in ways that made external Republican attacks look gentle by comparison. "It's not just opposition research or typical political backstabbing," David continued, and his voice carried a tone I'd never heard before, something between fascination and horror. "This is coordinated character assassination being conducted by people who are supposed to be on the same side. Schumer is getting taken apart by his own party leadership, and they're doing it with information that could only have come from inside sources." The scope of what had unfolded overnight was staggering. Millions of people who had invested their political hopes, their financial resources, and their personal reputations in supporting these figures were discovering that they had been deliberately misled by the very people they trusted most. Not through accidental miscommunications or honest mistakes, but through systematic campaigns of deception designed to extract maximum support while concealing fundamental truths about what these leaders actually represented. Let me start with what happened to Mamdani's supporters, because their story reveals something crucial about how political manipulation operates in the modern world. For months, activists across multiple countries had been organizing rallies, raising funds, and building political movements based on their understanding of Mamdani's mission and objectives. These weren't casual political followers. These were deeply committed individuals who had reorganized their lives around supporting what they believed was a transformative political movement. They had organized fundraising events, often contributing money they could barely afford. They had damaged relationships with family members who questioned their political choices. They had volunteered countless hours creating content, coordinating events, and recruiting new supporters. Many had built their personal identities around being part of what they understood to be a historic political transformation. They believed they were supporting someone who represented their values, fought for their interests, and shared their vision for political change. They were catastrophically wrong about everything. The revelation began with leaked documents appearing on social media platforms, shared by accounts with insider access to Mamdani's organization. These weren't external attacks from opponents, but communications from within his own network, revealing how he had explicitly described supporters as useful tools for achieving objectives that had nothing to do with their stated concerns. The first wave consisted of internal strategy documents revealing how Mamdani's organization had been conducting detailed psychological analysis of their supporter base, identifying emotional triggers to maximize financial contributions and political activism. Supporters were described in clinical terms that revealed complete contempt for their motivations and intelligence. The second wave revealed audio recordings where Mamdani had described supporters as useful idiots who could be manipulated into supporting policies they didn't understand. Video recordings showed him entertaining wealthy donors by imitating working-class supporters who had contributed money they couldn't afford to lose. Most devastatingly, the leaks revealed that Mamdani had been working directly with government officials and corporate interests that his supporters viewed as their primary opponents. Secret meetings where he had negotiated deals benefiting him personally while abandoning the policy positions his supporters had organized around achieving. The documentation was so comprehensive and authentic that denial became impossible. This wasn't opponents misrepresenting his positions. This was clear proof he had been systematically lying about his fundamental commitments while exploiting the trust of people who genuinely wanted positive change. The psychological impact on his supporters was immediate and devastating. These weren't casual political followers who could easily transfer their allegiance to alternative candidates. These were people who had organized their lives around supporting Mamdani's movement, who had damaged relationships with family members, who questioned their political choices, who had invested financial resources they couldn't afford to lose, who had built their personal identities around being part of what they believed was a transformative political cause. Discovering that their leader had been systematically deceiving them about everything that mattered most to them created a crisis that went far beyond normal political disappointment. These people had been manipulated at the deepest psychological level, exploited by someone who understood exactly which emotional triggers would generate maximum commitment while concealing his complete indifference to their actual welfare. The social media response was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. Supporters posting videos of themselves destroying Mamdani merchandise, sharing screenshots of private messages where they had defended him against criticism that turned out to be completely accurate, describing the financial sacrifices they had made based on fraudulent representations of how their contributions would be used. But the personal testimonials were even more heartbreaking. People describing how their support for Mamdani had cost them friendships, damaged their careers, created conflicts within their families, all based on beliefs that had been deliberately cultivated through systematic deception, designed to maximize their emotional investment while minimizing their ability to accurately assess what they were actually supporting. The betrayal was so comprehensive, so obviously calculated, that many of his former supporters began questioning their fundamental assumptions about political engagement itself. If someone they had trusted completely could deceive them so thoroughly about such basic facts, how could they ever again feel confident about supporting any political figure or cause? And this wasn't just the collapse of one political movement. It was an attack on the very possibility of democratic participation conducted by someone who had exploited the trust and idealism of people who genuinely wanted to make positive changes in the world. But while Mamdani's supporters were processing their devastation, something even more shocking was happening within the Democratic Party. Chuck Schumer was being systematically destroyed by his own colleagues in ways that revealed the complete breakdown of traditional political loyalties. The attack began during what was supposed to be a routine Democratic Party leadership meeting. Instead of usual discussions about legislative strategy, Schumer confronted a coordinated presentation of evidence that his own Democratic colleagues had been gathering about his financial arrangements, lobbyist communications, and private statements about party priorities. This wasn't external opposition research by Republican operatives. This was a comprehensive investigation by people who had worked with Schumer for years, with unprecedented access to information impossible for outside investigators to obtain. The presentation was led by Senator Elizabeth Warren, who had previously maintained cordial relationships with Schumer despite policy disagreements. But she revealed she had been conducting a sophisticated intelligence operation against her own party leader, gathering evidence of systematic corruption and deception. The financial allegations were devastating. Warren presented documents showing how Schumer's family members had benefited from government contracts awarded during his Senate leadership. Bank records showed payments to family-controlled businesses from companies receiving favorable legislative treatment. Timeline analyses demonstrated patterns where Schumer's policy positions shifted in ways coincidentally benefiting organizations with business relationships to his relatives. Even more damaging were recordings of private conversations where Schumer expressed views about Democratic voters and progressive activists that completely contradicted his public statements. He described progressive activists as useful idiots who could be manipulated into supporting policies they didn't understand. Young Democratic voters were characterized as temporary enthusiasts whose engagement could be exploited during elections but shouldn't influence long-term policy decisions. Most devastatingly, the recordings revealed detailed discussions of how different demographic groups could be manipulated through targeted messaging, unconnected to policies he intended to pursue. African American voters were discussed as reliable support extraction through civil rights appeals. Latino voters were characterized as single-issue targets, securable through immigration rhetoric regardless of other positions. But the most politically devastating revelations concerned Schumer's coordination with Republican leadership to undermine progressive initiatives while maintaining plausible deniability. Warren presented phone records showing communications with Republican operatives during supposed good-faith negotiations with Democratic colleagues. Financial documents revealed donors privately told Schumer wouldn't actually pursue policies he had publicly promised to support. Chuck Schumer has been lying to our voters, our activists, and our colleagues for years, Warren stated, her voice carrying a moral authority that made her accusations impossible to dismiss as typical political gamesmanship. He has used his position as Democratic leader to serve corporate interests while pretending to fight for working families. The evidence we have gathered proves that he cannot be trusted to represent Democratic values or priorities, and the presentation that followed was methodical, comprehensive, and absolutely devastating to Schumer's credibility. Phone records showing communications with Republican operatives during periods when he was supposedly negotiating in good faith with Democratic colleagues. Financial documents revealing donors who had been told privately that Schumer would not actually pursue policies he had publicly promised to support. Video recordings of closed-door meetings where he had described progressive activists as political liabilities who needed to be managed rather than listened to. The response from other Democratic senators was swift and brutal. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez called for Schumer's immediate resignation as party leader. Bernie Sanders described him as a corporate Democrat who has been deceiving progressive voters for his entire career. Even moderate Democrats who had previously supported Schumer's leadership began distancing themselves from someone who had clearly become a political liability. But perhaps the most damaging response came from Democratic voters themselves. Social media platforms were flooded with testimonials from people who had donated money, volunteered for campaigns, and voted based on Schumer's public promises, only to discover that he had been working behind the scenes to prevent the very policies they thought he was fighting to implement. The psychological impact was similar to what Mamdani's supporters had experienced, but potentially even more devastating because it involved the complete collapse of faith in the Democratic Party's leadership structure. These weren't people who had supported a single candidate or movement. These were lifelong Democrats who had trusted their party's leadership to represent their interests and values. Discovering that their own party leader had been systematically deceiving them about his priorities, his methods, and his actual commitment to democratic principles created a crisis of faith that extended far beyond Schumer himself. If the Democratic leader could be this thoroughly corrupt and deceptive, what did that say about the party as a whole? What did it mean about the possibility of achieving progressive change through traditional Democratic politics? The financial revelations were particularly damaging because they revealed the extent to which Schumer had personally benefited from the same corporate relationships that he had publicly criticized. Voters who had supported Democratic candidates based on promises to reduce corporate influence in politics were discovering that their own party leader had been enriching himself through exactly the kind of arrangements they thought they were voting to eliminate. But the strategic deceptions were even more demoralizing. Learning that Schumer had been privately assuring corporate donors that he would not actually pursue policies he had publicly endorsed meant that every Democratic campaign promise, every progressive initiative, every reform proposal had to be viewed with suspicion about whether party leadership was genuinely committed to implementation. The collapse was so comprehensive that it raised fundamental questions about the viability of the Democratic Party as a vehicle for progressive change. If the leadership structure was this thoroughly compromised, if the gap between public promises and private intentions was this vast, if the party's most senior figures were this willing to deceive their own supporters, then what was the point of continued Democratic participation? These weren't isolated incidents of political disappointment or routine examples of politicians failing to live up to campaign promises. These were systematic campaigns of deception that had been designed to extract maximum support from people while concealing fundamental truths about what that support would actually accomplish. The coordination between these revelations was too precise to be coincidental. Someone with extraordinary resources and sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare had orchestrated the simultaneous destruction of both Mamdani's support network and Schumer's political career in ways that maximized the damage to democratic institutions and public faith in political leadership. The message was clear to anyone paying attention. Trust no one. Question everything. Assume that any political figure, regardless of their public statements or apparent principles, could be deceiving you about their most basic motivations and commitments. This wasn't just the destruction of two political careers. It was an attack on the very possibility of democratic engagement, conducted in ways that would make millions of people question whether political participation was worth the risk of being systematically manipulated by people who understood exactly how to exploit their hopes and ideals for personal gain. The long-term implications are staggering. When supporters discover they've been deliberately deceived by political figures they trusted completely, when party leaders are revealed to be working against the interests of their own voters, when the gap between public promises and private intentions becomes this vast and this obviously calculated, the result isn't just disappointment or anger. The result is the complete breakdown of the social trust that makes democratic governance possible. People stop believing that political engagement can produce positive change. They become cynical about all political figures and institutions. They withdraw from civic participation, or, even worse, they become susceptible to authoritarian appeals that promise to destroy the entire system that has betrayed them. What happened to Mamdani's supporters and Schumer's Democratic colleagues represents the weaponization of political disillusionment. Someone understood that destroying trust in democratic institutions could be achieved more effectively through calculated betrayals by trusted figures than through external attacks by obvious opponents. The phone call that morning opened my eyes to a form of political warfare that's unlike anything I encountered during my presidency. We're not just dealing with opposition between different political parties or ideological movements. We're witnessing the systematic destruction of the social bonds that make democratic society possible, conducted by people who understand that trust once destroyed is almost impossible to rebuild. The long-term implications extend far beyond immediate political damage to Mamdani's movement and Schumer's career. When supporters discover they've been deliberately deceived by trusted political figures, when party leaders work against their own voters' interests, when the gap between public promises and private intentions becomes this vast, the result isn't just disappointment or anger. The result is complete breakdown of social trust that makes democratic governance possible. People stop believing political engagement can produce positive change, become cynical about all political figures and institutions, and withdraw from civic participation entirely. Worse, they become susceptible to authoritarian appeals promising to destroy the entire system that has betrayed their trust. What happened to Mamdani's supporters and Schumer's Democratic colleagues represents deliberate weaponization of political disillusionment. Someone understood that destroying trust in democratic institutions can be achieved more effectively through calculated betrayals by trusted figures than through external attacks by obvious opponents. The sophistication suggests coordination by individuals with extraordinary resources, technological capabilities, and psychological expertise. The simultaneous revelations, comprehensive documentation, strategic timing, and careful orchestration indicate planning beyond what typical political opponents could achieve. The psychological impact extends beyond immediate victims. Every political activist must consider whether their chosen candidates might be systematically deceiving them. Every Democratic voter must question whether their party's leadership represents their interests or provides more sophisticated manipulation. Every progressive organization must wonder whether their cooperation with Democratic leadership advances their goals or simply provides legitimacy for policies serving entirely different constituencies. The revelations weren't isolated incidents addressable through leadership changes or institutional reforms. They represent systematic challenges to basic assumptions that make democratic participation psychologically sustainable for ordinary citizens. When political engagement becomes this psychologically dangerous, when trust becomes this unreliable, when the gap between promises and intentions becomes this vast, democracy itself becomes impossible to maintain. The phone call that morning opened my eyes to political warfare techniques going far beyond anything I encountered during my presidency. We're dealing with systematic attacks on the psychological foundations of democratic society conducted by actors who understand that destroying citizen faith in authentic representation is more effective than any traditional assault on democratic institutions. Most Americans have no idea how fundamentally political engagement has changed. They're thinking about politics in terms of policy disagreements and electoral competition between candidates representing different governance approaches. They don't understand they're living through emergence of warfare strategies designed to make democratic participation seem hopeless by demonstrating that political leaders will systematically exploit citizen trust regardless of apparent principles. The operations targeting Mamdani's supporters and Schumer's standing were examples of techniques being deployed across the political spectrum to undermine public confidence in authentic democratic representation. Similar operations target conservative figures, progressive movements, religious organizations, labor unions, and any institutions that could serve as vehicles for genuine citizen political engagement. Each follows similar patterns: infiltrate trusted institutions, gather comprehensive documentation of hypocrisy and betrayal, reveal information in ways maximizing psychological damage to supporters' faith in political possibility, and repeat until public cynicism becomes so pervasive that democratic participation seems pointless to most citizens. The ultimate objective isn't promoting particular political agendas or policy positions. The objective is creating a political environment where citizen engagement becomes so psychologically dangerous and consistently disappointing that most people withdraw entirely, leaving governance to small elite groups operating without meaningful public oversight or accountability. We're witnessing systematic destruction of social trust that makes democratic society possible, conducted through techniques most citizens don't recognize as attacks on democracy itself. The operations appear to expose corruption and hold political figures accountable, but the actual effect is convincing ordinary people that all political engagement is systematic manipulation designed to exploit their hopes for others' benefit. The question isn't whether these techniques will continue. The methods are proven effective, technology becomes more sophisticated yearly, and incentives are too powerful for any political actor to resist indefinitely. The question is whether enough Americans will recognize what's happening in time to develop responses preserving meaningful democratic governance before systematic destruction of political trust makes citizen engagement psychologically impossible for most people. Based on what I learned from that phone call and continue learning from sources monitoring these operations, I'm increasingly concerned we may be past the point where traditional democratic responses can address challenges operating at this level of psychological sophistication and technological capability. Most people still believe they're living in a democracy where citizen engagement can influence government policy through electoral participation and civic activism. They don't understand they're living in a system where political trust is being systematically destroyed through techniques designed to make democratic governance psychologically impossible to sustain. The game has changed, the players have changed, the rules have changed, and most Americans are still operating according to assumptions about political possibility that no longer correspond to how power actually works in contemporary America.